ain't a podcast that's flyer. You are now tuned in to Direct Misfire. Benson, Hugh, and Selick. Tell everyone to tune in. Let's roll the dice. Let me show you what we doing. A fantasy war game. Play it smart and you win. What you know about the crystal pen and the retribution? Hero, giants, and knights galore. It's an adventure. This is Kings of War. Let's go.
Hey guys, Selick here. With Kings of War increasingly picking up new players as its popularity soars, I wanted to whip up a quick video to assist in a more timeless fashion. While most of our Sneaky Tactics episode is still very valid, the Clash of Kings updates to rules have rendered some of those moves now illegal, particularly around the disengagement rules. Bit of a disclaimer before we do jump in, however. When absorbing these areas of focus and tips, try to treat them more as checkpoints of consideration during your game and reflection points for after the game. These tips are tailored more towards beginner and intermediate type middle of the pack players looking to improve overall results, but definitely may be helpful reminder for the seasoned professional. Enough of the intro, let's get into it. Direct Misfire's top 5 areas to improve your Kings of War game and how. Starting off with arguably the most obvious, but the most important one, play the objective. Even though this is literally the only way to win a game of Kings of War, it's still one of the most seen mistakes on the tabletop. I've noticed over the years, experienced players, they never really lose focus of the objectives over the course of the game. That said, Turn 4 seems to be the universal milestone to pause and reflect on where your scoring units or units with more than one unit strength are on the tabletop. I personally choose Turn 4 as you're usually in the thick of things and it still allows you to make decisions and have time to act on those for the objective play. Let's have a look at some of the tips. Sacrifices for the greater good. You may find yourself in a position, usually around turn 5 or 6, where your opponent can simply move onto an objective or a token, which may be the difference between a win or a loss. Consider throwing one of your units or multiple units into an opponent purely to stop its movement. This may well result in your unit dying immediately next turn, but at least your opponent is then limited to a D6 range overrun instead of its normal movement. This can be done multiple times to defer a unit from scoring by movement. Just be careful about using individuals for this that aren't mighty. Don't go chasing waterfalls or kills. I've seen this far too often. When the blood is flowing, you see a juicy 20-inch flank charge, you charge out, you destroy that 275 point unit, while flexing your biceps over your crushing victory. You rapidly realise that it was turn 5 or 6 and your charges now put you outside of that scoring range of an objective to win the game. Let's be fair here, there's going to be times when you want to charge that super expensive killer unit that's offered up a rear or a flank, but it should never be by removing your ability to win a game to do so. Sometimes it's best to just avoid combat in turn 6 and just go for the safe play of objective scoring altogether. Next up, we've got the lure. Much like we've just explained, a tactic that works for some players is the lure. It's purely a setup move. So if you've got a unit that cannot score an objective at the moment, you can position a tasty flank or a rear charge that your opponent will then have to digest. If they take that flank or that rear, they'll be moving off of the objective, reducing their strength on the game. If you are trying this one, it does tell me that you're in a pretty dire situation, however, that your unit that you're sacrificing couldn't score itself, nor kill a unit that is scoring. Important note on this one, however, if you are using the lure, remember that your opponent can overrun D6 forward or D3 sideways or backwards, which can get them back into range of an objective. So just be careful. Our fourth tip here is reforming with purpose. It may sound a little bit strange, but in turn 4 and 5, post-combat reforms are very important for objective play. It's easy to get caught up in setting up the next charge or anticipating your opponent's next turn for a counter charge. While all of these things are very important in their own right, just pause for a moment and have a mental checkpoint and ask yourself quickly, does this direction enable my unit to get an objective in the next 2 turns? Can I position this unit so if I move at the double, I can contest an objective? Should I reform with the objective of keeping this unit safe for scoring purposes. Once you've digested and considered all of this, you'll know if you should be reforming for safety, offense, or scoring purposes. This is a good segue into the second area of focus, and that is unit positioning. Easily one of the most important parts of a Kings of War or many a rank or flank game, it is also the element of play that very good players do extremely well and new players really stumble at. So let's find a few tips. When moving each unit that you've naturally marked the original location, make sure that you consider the following defensive checks. What can charge this unit? Am I offering any unwanted flank or rear charges? Will this unit just get chaffed up? If so, what is that unit and can I get rid of it? Is my angle going to assist me get flanks or rears if I counterattack? Will a charging unit be hindered on this angle or position? Am I getting cover or providing cover to another of my units? Did I just move into range of an opponent's shooting unit? Can I move that unit and force them to reposition to shoot me? On the flip side, here's some offensive checkpoints. Is my leader point and charge distance facilitating a next turn charge? Is my leader point allowing me to shoot this turn without cover? Is it best not to move at all and shoot with additional hits? Do I have enough space to maneuver my units if I get in trouble, left or right? Will this move restrict my opponent's movement? Will this move open up a flank or a rear charge opportunities for me in the next turn? Will this move stop one of my units from hitting terrain on the charge? Once you've considered all these things and built it into your gameplay, sort of like a muscle memory, you'll find that those tiny 5-degree pivots here and there can really be the difference in what your opponent does next turn. It can force a defensive reaction for them retreating to get out of range, or the complete opposite with offense, forcing them to fall into your well-laid trap. One aspect of the game that any new player will find themselves in is the Mexican standoff. This is where you have fast, speedy units on both sides of the table, neither wanting to make the first move because they will simply get charged. While this scenario is common, how to get around it starts in the list design and flows into deployment and then your gameplay. My tips for Mexican standoff are: deploy some shooting units with 24-inch shooting or further with your fast movers. As the standoff continues, you'll be chipping away wounds. This will force your opponent to make the first move or allow you to get enough wounds to start forcing route checks with little to no risk. The second thing that you can do is with your chaff. If you've got a chaff unit, this is their time to shine. The key here is simple: sacrifice the chaff unit with little to no risk on your offensive units as possible. They can move up aggressively, meaning that your opponent has to either charge them or be charged by them. Alternatively, the chaff can be moving up tactically. Tactically, this is a lot easier if you have more units in the standoff than your opponent, but with clever positioning, you're able to block charges and force your opponent into the chaff unit which you want them to. Another option I've found is through individuals. I've found that high defense and snare, cheap individuals with decent nerve are usually good at breaking the standoff. If you're starting to lose the war of attrition, consider moving a mounted hero up. Your opponent now has to think, do I want to charge that 120 point non-scoring unit and then get countercharged? If they go with it, you've got an easy countercharge from another unit. Your individual can then back up and move around to disorder another unit in the standoff. This hesitation and thought process can do weird things to gamers. Some will only send small units to kill your hero, resulting in your hero holding. He can simply then, once again, back up, charge another unit, disorder it, leaving that original target in no man's land for your other units. This will break the standoff, but you'll have the advantage. The other thing I've seen this do is break the standoff altogether, with your opponent becoming very aggressive, moving multiple units up. A major factor to consider with any movement is terrain, and that is going to be my area of focus number 3. Over your Kings of War journey, terrain is going to be your best friend, as well as your worst and most hated enemy. My tips to consider here: deploy with terrain in mind. Are you going to have to move into that terrain to shoot and therefore take a penalty? If your opponent gets the first turn, are you in cover from their shooting? Can you move the double without being blocked by terrain? If you don't get the first turn, do your fast units still have good board control to restrict your opponent's moves? Where will the battles likely take place? Are your Pathfinders and Strider units in the right position? Alternatively, where are their Pathfinder and Strider units? Is the terrain irrelevant to them? It may go without saying, but do whatever you can to force your opponents, without Pathfinder or Strider special rules, into or through terrain to charge you. Use your own units to avoid your charges being hindered. A simple setup and block can actually be a huge difference when you're looking at large volumes of attacks. Survival. Sounds dramatic, but late game and early game War Machine attacks use that terrain to avoid being charged or shot at. This is the best protection your units can get. Whether they have objectives or you're simply trying to protect an expensive unit for attrition points, this is the smart play. But all the best positioning and use of terrain in the world would not avoid your opponent rolling some lucky nerve check dice. This is where my number 4 tip, use your inspiring wisely, comes into play. Forcing an opponent to re-roll that 11 on the dice that will break your unit could very well be the difference between a win and a loss. My tips for using your inspiring. Double check your inspiring bubble. The amount of times in a game that I've seen an unlucky spike in dice on a critical unit and it be less than 1 inch out of the inspiring range would make anyone cry. So just double check you're inside that bubble. Maximize your inspiring. Very similar to the first one, but when you're moving that inspiring source, try and get as many units inspired as possible. It sounds like a fundamental or a basic one, but a wise opponent will always target the unit that's outside of inspiring. When building your list, a general rule is to have 3 or more inspiring sources in a 2000 point or more game. All that said, inspiring works both ways. My tips for countering inspiring. Particularly for low nerve armies, sometimes targeting inspiring sources early game can help you out late game. During the nerve checks in the shooting phase or at the start of a combat phase, always start with your opponent's inspiring source first. Even if this is a Hail Mary play needing double 6s as a result, it's worth it, and it's really great training for your gaming processes. If you can remove the inspiring source before all the other nerve checks, you've removed a reroll on nerve checks for the rest of the game, and that is big. Our final area of focus is target priority. You're going to find yourself in situations, be it with charges or shooting, where you have multiple options. There is no flowchart or right or wrong options, but there is a series of considerations before making a decision. My tips for target priority would be clear chaff. Do I need to clear chaff to prevent my hammer units getting pinned down? The safety. This is when you charge a target that you'll likely destroy in one turn, with no other units able to charge you back. Once you've won that combat, you'll reform nicely and be able to turn and face some of the flanks and rears of your opponent. I personally like this in turn 1 and 2, as it's a nice safe option without dedicating to a long combat, but also really handy in 5 and 6 when you just want to get in, finish a combat and then pivot for objective play. Pop the bubble. If there's a target that's providing an aura or it's got healing or inspiring, this is a nice good target to pick. Anything that you can help grind or remove rerolls or heals will help you across the entire game. Hurt the hammer. Can I remove or cripple a major hammer unit in my opponent's army? Sometimes sacrificing a unit but putting on 15 wounds on your opponent's major hammer is the right option. Total wounds. This is when you're targeting a unit to maximize the total amount of wounds. This is usually because it's got a low defense or it's out and doesn't have any cover. The next one is the soften up. This is where you want to put a few wounds on a unit so that when you do finally charge it, you can take it off in one turn. So if you consider a 15-17 unit, you need to put on quite a few wounds in a combat phase to be able to reliably take that off in one turn. Sometimes you'll want to be targeting these units with shooting to take off that 4 or 5 wounds before they get into combat to make it nice and easy when you do. The Thinker. I will occasionally charge, purely to make my opponent think. Usually this is a flank or a rear charge, and the objective here isn't to cause mass damage, it is purely to make my opponent think. They generally have two options. Turn to face the unit that I've just charged and attempt to kill it, revealing its flank if it doesn't destroy it, or it could ignore it completely and I've just got a few extra free wounds on it. Purely for the test. So that's when you will target a unit purely to try and trigger a route test. This is particularly important in late game where you just want one wound on it just so that you can trigger the test. As the game goes on, this becomes increasingly important. The final one here is just the scenario play. So should I be targeting a unit with the unit strength, or it has an objective, purely so that I can win the game? As you can see, most of these focus areas, if I could put a simple paraphrase version of it, is maximize the number and probability of your dice hits and reduce them against you. If you're doing this well, you're putting yourself in a really good position not to break in one turn, keeping you and your unit strength inside the game. I hope you found these areas of tips helpful. If you've got any tips you'd like to be added or you want to be communicated out to the wider community, feel free to just comment below or reach out on Facebook or Twitter. Happy gaming, guys.
Thank you for tuning in with my team. Make sure you follow on Facebook and Twitter. Yes, indeed, more than a game, it's a lifestyle. Yes, sir. Hope you realize that the math hammer doesn't work. We give the people what they desire. Australian War Gaming Podcast, direct misfire. You don't want to miss a thing. Yeah, we got plenty more. If you're ready, let's go. Stay tuned, that's for sure. Hey.